energi att fortsätta och gå på ett nytt projekt.
About endlessness.
Hey!
I will be in prison for this scene. Actually, I must confess that it's not perfect title. At my age, it's heavy to make a movie, especially with our kind of making it.
Our process is so strange. Working in this way is messy because it's about Roy's feelings. The most pressure is from himself.
My main issue through all the movies is self-confidence and lack of self-confidence. It's hard mentally and physically to make a feature. Maybe a glass of whiskey will help me to relax and to feel it.
Has it become part of your creative process, drinking?
Roy is aware of the situation, but it's quite critical. We need him to want to change, and we don't know if that's possible.
Not very surprised, but disappointed.
You asked me if I am in all these characters. I think I am. I am in all of them.
Varför har du övergivit mig?
This movie follows me all hours. It's there. It's like a prison. You can't escape your work, and you can't escape yourself either.
This is my final effort. I must say, this is what I am able to make.
Hello and welcome to The Living Room, brought to you by Curzon Home Cinema. If you're watching this live via YouTube, you can join the conversation in the comments section or send us questions via Twitter with the hashtag at Curzon Cinemas, with the Twitter handle, sorry, at Curzon Cinemas, and please use the hashtag being a human person. To refer to the cinema of Roy Andersson as unique is something of an understatement. For the last 50 years and across a small selection of features and shorts, as well as a prolific career directing countless inspired TV ads, Andersson has explored with startling combination of pathos and humor our place in the world. And now with the fascinating documentary Being a Human Person, director Fred Scott shines a light on Andersson's obsessions and working process. And I'm delighted to welcome Fred to The Living Room. Hello, Fred.
Hi, Ian. How you doing?
First of all, congratulations on your film.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. 3.5 years worth of, as you'd expect with Roy, a very longitudinal process. You have to be patient, but yeah, we've got here in the end, and it's amazing, really, because it's been a very warm reception to the film, and yeah, it's incredible, really. Documentary, especially the way I make documentaries, is quite a insular process. So when you get to this stage and you get to share it with everyone, and people are talking about it in kind of warm terms, it's amazing, really heartening.
So I wanted to talk about the whole creative process that you went on, and going back even further to the inspiration for the film. But perhaps we could start with the very end of your documentary and the faint glimmer of hope that Roy Andersson might not have made his final film. Is it true that he is working on something else?
I think Roy's always working on something else. I think he's the non-stop kind of flux of his creative mind, I think, will never kind of end. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd never say never. Like, about a third of the way through my process of making the documentary, it was determined that this would highly likely be his final film, and that ever-growing sense just became a sort of bigger part of the story as we went along. But I definitely live in hope myself, and I'm sure a lot of people do, that something will change. It's just the way that Roy makes films and his team make films is to speak brutally, is totally illogical and fittingly just completely absurd, you know, for Roy. It's like they're just these operatic this operatic process that they go through every single time is so utterly unique, and for them to sustain that as long as they have is an incredible achievement. But I know there's always short film ideas that he's working on. I know he's got a project that is more more sort of insular to him, and something he can focus on and not rely on a sort of mechanic and a team around him to work on. But who knows? Like, who knows? On About Endlessness, they were trying to make the film at kind of double time. So maybe there'll be a way of achieving that in the future. But at the moment, I think he's sort of re-energizing and getting some well-earned sort of recuperation time.
So anyone who watches your documentary has a wonderful insight into Roy Andersson's working process, but I think it would be impossible not to recognize the level of passion that you have for his work throughout the whole of the film. Could you talk about what your first encounter with a Roy Andersson film was?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would, first and foremost, I'd say this is not entry-level Roy Andersson where I started. Like I saw at film school, saw World of Glory, which is a short film of his, about 15-odd minute short film. And it is a very brutal, unforgettable short film.
So we see some of it in the documentary, don't we? The gassing
exactly,
in the van.
So the gas truck scene, which even in the documentary, that short moment is unforgettable, really. But I saw that, and it's brutal. It is a very strong comment about our collective history. It's a lot of it is about guilt, which is a theme that runs through a lot of Roy's work. But also it has that confrontation to it, but also manages to have an element of compassion to it as well. And there are, even in this 15-minute short film, you get the full gamut of kind of emotions. And the fact that Roy can achieve that kind of spirit, starting from a scene so utterly impactful as that gas truck scene is incredible, really. So that was where I started, and I just never really, I was just so taken aback by what I'd seen. I'd never experienced anything like that in film before, and I just waited patiently, really, for, as you have to be if you're waiting for anything Roy does, you have to wait sort of 5 odd years at least until the next film comes out, and just really followed him. And at that time, it felt like a bit of a secret club that you're in. Anyone who knew Roy Andersson was like, oh, and it was like a sort of quite sort of niche. And I just wanted to try to create some kind of conversation around Roy, really. And I felt loaded with the idea that in a decade or a couple of decades time, that people, even if you had a passing interest in film, you'd look back and you'd wonder who was this person who made films entirely on his own terms and who created this utterly unique film language, as you were saying before, and also lived and worked in the same building, in this kind of cross-section of this building, where really unassuming building in central Stockholm. It's fascinating, really, as a story.
But then I guess what's the thing that comes out of the film that I found very interesting in the early stages, and we open with this discussion of the importance of art, and you look back through history, whether it's Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo or many other artists, Frans Hals, Rembrandt, they worked in and lived in their studios. And what's really interesting, I thought the other thing with art that your film really highlights is that the artists that Roy loves don't respond to the whims, fashions, or trends of the moment, and they're producing something that reaches beyond the present. And it really strikes me that's something that his films have consistently done. Exactly
that. And I think on the we always talked about it as a sort of Rembrandt sort of concept that he started the studio in 1981 in the form that it is now, as you're saying, starting with the commercials and then getting into the short films. And that, I think, when Studio 24 was established, it was far more of that dynamic of the kind of the singular vision of a Rembrandt, for example, with the sort of apprentices surrounding them. And not to say that Roy's incredibly democratic in the way that he works and inclusive, but I think it felt, from what I've seen and learned, it felt that was more the sort of model of creativity that ran at the studio at that time. But I think what I learned on About Endlessness was that it became more apparent that those around Roy were really important to get the film made, and he actually needed to sort of rely on the team more than perhaps he had done in the past. And that's not to say it didn't still have that singular vision that has always that runs throughout all of Roy's films. But I think he just needed the dynamic slightly changed on About Endlessness because of what Roy was going through, really. So, but it's interesting. Like it was very much that idea of having your whole world in one building and having that total and utter control on your art and your life is utterly unique, especially in the context of a modern film world. And I just that thought of when Roy stops making films in whatever form they may be, that's an end of an era. Like, I can't see how this would ever be replicated again. Like, maybe animation's the closest you can get in terms of finding a similar kind of model of creating art. But in terms of moving image, yeah, he's the last of his kind, I think.
Yeah, I think you even have contemporary directors such as Ruben Östlund, who is a huge fan of him. Even he says that he's spoken on the living room about the fact that that creative freedom is just, whether you want it or not, it's just not something that you can actually get easily.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And he's just created it from the ground up, really, Roy. And it had to be. There was a certain way that he wanted to make films, and through his genius, he's created this. He's created this visual language and this language of film that is so utterly unique that I guess that the only way he could achieve that is literally just creating this whole world, this whole building in one place, and not have to rely on any, well, to a certain extent, rely on any outside kind of source or support. Really, it's so singular in that way. It's fascinating, really. I've racked my brain trying to find a sort of comparative artist who works in the same way, but it's really bizarre and fascinating. And when I first started to learn about Roy's, that sort of 18, 19 years ago, like, that curiosity really is always retained. And I just wanted to make sure that we recorded it. Like, it's important to have captured a moment in time. And what I didn't know going into the process that I was doing was that it was a particularly interesting time to be with him, and in terms of the film he was making, the most biographical film he'd ever made.
So how did you go about getting access to this incredibly rarefied world?
Which, as ever, a documentary, really, persistence, really. I mean, Curzon have a hand in this. So, I mean, Curzon were a kind of sort of Cupid in this situation, so to speak. Back in 2015, I went to Roy's. I went to the Q&A of A Pigeon Sat on a Branch, reflecting on existence, and it just struck me when you see. I'd learned a bit about Roy at that stage, and obviously was an admirer of his films, but it just struck me when you see him in person, he is quite a captivating individual and quite enigmatic, and he was just really very interesting at the Q&A, what he was saying, and he takes his time over talking, so very considered about how he talks. But one thing that was really interesting was that he was talking about his next film, which was called About the Infinite, I think at the time, variation on the same theme. He was talking about it being about the sorrow of realizing time is running out, and you could see just his, he was 73 odds then, so not, not certainly not old, but you could just him talking about his next project in those terms, and it was just really interesting. And so I just contacted his studio afterwards. I met Roy afterwards, but I mean, there was no sort of profound moment there at all. But I contacted his studio afterwards, and it took about a year, 18 months or so of not sort of like hounding them, but just sort of periodically just checking in and just seeing whether they had started the film, and eventually they let me turn up and do like a test shoot. But I think for the studio it was a big deal, obviously, because they are quite a closed world. Like, it's a very friendly place, but it's a closed world. They are understandably very protective of Roy. They wouldn't want distractions around Roy because he needs that time to think. That's very much part of Roy's way of working. So it did take a bit of time, and then we agreed to do a test shoot. And it was, I think the first one was like a 3-day shoot, which was the longest I ever spent there in the end. But the rest of them were kind of these sort of super low budget 1-day kind of visits. But yeah, we did. But yeah, it took a bit of time just to sort of to get in there, really, and just show that I was sort of sensitive in how I was going to approach it.
He is surprisingly disarming in conversation on a one-to-one basis. I know you said it took a year to win them over, the idea that you would go over there. Was he quite open though from the outset, or did that also take a while?
He's the first couple of interviews he talked a lot about, obviously at that time I'm just trying to find a film really and just work out what I'm making, because the first and foremost I didn't want to make a hagiography, and I didn't want it to feel like a fan film in terms of like I wanted it to, you could see the respect and sort of sensitivity, but I didn't want it to feel like I wanted it to ensure there was definite sort of depth to the film for sure. And he was, so in those first few interviews we very much just covered that foundation of going through the themes. And when Roy talks about his interest in the vulnerable and confidence, etc., and he talks about it in a very personal way, like very much from that these are the themes that interest him, but they're also the themes that have touched his life, and they are the themes that dictate his how he is and how he holds himself in a room and with people. Immediately that's already quite interesting. You've got this guy who's just come off the back of winning the Golden Lion at Venice. He beat Birdman to the kind of the top prize at Venice in 2014, but even he's talking in these terms where, I feel like an amateur, etc. And you when you start to unpick that, it just becomes this really interesting journey of creativity and confidence, I think. But that was the start point, and then it took, after about a year, the other side of the story started to come in, and that was something that I didn't know about before I went to the studio, and it really started to dictate the way that the documentary unfolded.
Yeah, it's fascinating to watch, because there's this long history of talking about artists, writers, creatives, about the role of alcohol and other substances in the creative process, that it can be seen as a positive thing. It can feed into that creative process up to a point. And it is very interesting that where you focus on that in the film, we do see the one side that this is something that kind of feeds him, and it's a prop. But when that prop becomes so essential that it takes over a little too much, it becomes a destructive thing. I was surprised that was in there, and it struck me that must have shown a level of trust that you'd built up with Roy and the production team at the time. Was it difficult eventually to try and integrate that into the film?
There was a sort of turning point really, and there's a shot in the film that is in the context of how we've treated the rest of the film. It is quite sort of furtive in the way that it captures Roy and his drinking problem. But the reason it's in the film is because it was genuinely the moment that I realised the level that this problem was, that it got to a certain level, and that was the justification, even though it's quite sort of complicated shot to include. But in terms of the trust element, it's a tricky one. I just really was just totally open with Roy, and it was really, the problem was affecting the whole dynamic of the studio. It was affecting his ability to create, and so to have not allowed the film to be dictated by that in a certain way would have not been authentic to how things were working at the studio at the time. But Roy, it's incredibly brave for Roy to embrace that process and accept the fact that we're going to talk about this, and he's going to be so open about it and explore it. Like I personally, as a documentary maker, putting someone in a place where they feel comfortable enough to reconcile big problems in life, like live on camera in real time, is the greatest privilege. And for Roy to have done that was amazing, really. But it definitely took some encouraging in terms of, like, I wanted him to give me a chance to edit me and Michael Arglen, the brilliant editor on the film, to actually create a film that has that subject matter in it and show him that we can handle it sensitively. And going back to that point of About Endlessness being his most biographical film, it really, that line of art and life really started to converge around the time of the problem reaching its kind of its peak, really. So we started to have this very interesting mode of telling a story of both the art and the person as well. So we just followed that lead, really. But he was amazing, Roy, to to allow me to ask him about that and be quite sort of upfront with him about what I was witnessing. And we didn't include quite a lot more of what Roy talked about and the depth that he went into, because I mentioned everyone's protective, but I was protective of him as well. Like the whole approach to this before that whole issue of the drinking came up was to peek behind the magician's curtain rather than sort of like tear the curtain down. It was really about trying to have a look at this process and try to understand the creator as best as we can, but without deconstructing things fully, because part of what Roy does is there's a sort of magic to it, and we wanted to protect that as well.
It's interesting, within the film, we hear at the beginning Roy talking about what to call his new film, and it struck me when we reached that point in the film where he's talking about his problems with alcohol, the title of the film made total sense, because I think in some other universe, the more palindromic being a human being would make sense, but the person, it just gives it the much more intimate sense of what that film really is.
Great. Well, that's great to hear. Roy does say, he certainly said to me in an interview a couple of times, being a human being. But yeah, we went for the person to give it that extra sort of distinction, really, and give that sort of slightly different perspective on it. But yes, I mean that's the thing. What is just incredible about Roy's work is if you can just give these clues to kind of what's going on in Roy's mind, it really enriches the art that he creates, and this film in particular was really holding up a mirror at times, really, and we as I said, like, we really want to be sensitive with that and be gentle with that. Like, it really didn't want to kind of be too didactic with it in terms of how we actually treated about endlessness and what Roy was going through. It's about sort of gently just showing the way, really, and trying to explain and understand better what he was going through. But as you say, like, Roy, he does deal with the sort of timeless and the inevitable, and there's something about that is really moving and beautiful and poetic. And what I've always loved about him is you get that side of his storytelling, but you also, the way that he can shine a light on the absurd and the trivial, the banal, the funny, in ways that feel familiar and enlightening is really kind of beautiful. To have that, to be able to weave that all into his art is such an achievement. It's incredible, really.
We see two very brief glimpses of his commercial directing career, with the wedding and the car door being ripped off, and you can go online on YouTube and see many examples of his work. And there's even a brilliant send-up of the classic Hollywood sketch of people carrying a pane of glass across the road, and seeing how that plays out is just genius. But it struck me, it must have been a real challenge for you, being such an admirer of his work, to actually choose what clips to put in the film.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, and also it's like, and the periods of his career to include as well, because, like, I mean, that, going back to what I said at the start, I mean, that's entry level Roy Andersson. The commercials is definitely where I'd recommend someone to start if they weren't familiar with his work, because they're brilliant single shot commercials, so precise, and definitely you can see where the genesis of his vision today comes from, definitely. But yeah, in terms of the clips, that was very much a collaboration with Michael Ogden, the editor, and the producers on this film from Archer's Mark, in terms of actually honing down what we wanted to use and just to get the right balance, really, and not like I say, be too didactic and too literal in what we were trying to say. But commercials wise, you really can, yeah, you can spend hours, days, probably longer, trying to work out which of those to pick from, because they're just incredible. Like, the standard with which he created commercials is just is unrivaled. I think it's just they're and they were so unique. Like, Roy would really run with like a creative. Like, often he was just writing the script and creating the idea, and they're the kind of commercials that, because they are single shot, they could seem simple on kind of first look, but they are so precise and so choreographed. Like the one you talk about with the pane of glass it's like one thing happens, but then there are like 2, 3, 4 other things that happen, and it's, you know, like, obviously the historically there's sort of Chaplin and Keaton. That's where that sort of humor comes from, but you can really trace it through Roy's films and into many other sort of areas of comedic genre today, really.
I've got a couple of questions from the audience,
Yes.
but before I go to those, I've just You mentioned earlier about peeking past the curtain, and you have his personal life. The other thing that surprised me is the willingness to give away the magic of the filmmaking process. And was that a little bit of an uphill battle, or were they quite open?
No, actually pretty open, like remarkably open, like really. So, no, it was. I think they knew my approach was always going to be. I was going to be very protective of that process. But it's incredible, really. Like there's a nice sequence in the film where the camera pulls back into the sort of world, the trompe l'oeil world that they sometimes use in some of the scenes that give you the illusion of like this much more expansive world than you're seeing on screen, certainly than you're seeing in person, where it just looks so homemade, really, in a way, with all due respect, like how when you're actually in there in the studio, when you look on the monitor, it's incredible, and it's like it is this magic of the illusion where it all pulls together. But they were, maybe it's because actually when you deconstruct it and you're in the studio, you're almost not giving away too much. It's so disconnected that it's impossible to to sort of put the pieces together unless you're looking straight through the camera at the monitor. Maybe they felt secure in the fact that I wouldn't be able to fully destroy the illusion.
I've got a question here from Jen from Reading, who said that the first time I saw these films was in art college, and you've shown me a whole world. So thank you very much. But did you feel that there was, or did you feel any sense of danger at any point in time that there wouldn't be an end, that Roy wouldn't actually finish making the film?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and also in terms of our process, like at the end of 2018, we thought we were going to finish filming at the end of 2018, which, when I say 2018 now, this is remarkable, approaching 2021. But we thought it was going to be done then. Roy got invited in competition at a very prestigious film festival, and it also turned out that it was 50 years since his first film had been presented at that film festival and at Berlin, and so we had this sort of neat circularity, and it was all pulling together quite neatly, but as ever with Roy, kind of too neatly, really. And and then Roy got to a point, health-wise and mental health-wise, that he had to essentially take 3 months off. So from our process, that effectively means an extra year of production, and definitely at that point there were a lot of question marks over whether he would be able to come back and finish the film. They had sort of 2-3 scenes to finish then, which doesn't sound like much, but considering all his scenes tend to take at least a month to make each scene, that was still a lot of toil to go, really. So definitely there was a point where we would sort of try to work out how this would end, and or how much longer we'd have to wait to find an end, really. On the Berlin thing, actually, it turned out we finished the film, and this is another classic Andersson thing. We realised it was actually 49 years since he was at Berlin. So we had gone, oh, this is going to be perfect. This is such a neat ending, and then actually it would have been not quite as neat as we thought. But yeah, definitely there was definitely a point when we thought we were going to have to find another way to finish it.
And with your actual filming the process of about Anderssonus, it takes them about a month to shoot each of these sequences. Were you able to work out in advance what ones you were going to travel over to and film in the studio, sort of the more complex ones, or a variety of them?
Definitely. There were conversations about which would be the most ambitious or the most interesting to film, or thematically the maybe the sort of best ones to film in terms of having sort of the most interesting or complex set design, etc. But it was really, I mean, my process was illogical and very, very hard because this was a very hard film to get funding from, and in fact we didn't really achieve that until the end. And for the first 16 months, it was just a question of getting there when I could, and I probably did 4 visits to Stockholm in that time, and like I say, sort of day visits, just trying to sort of get what I could and find the film. But yeah, it was they were very collaborative, Studio 24, in terms of informing me of what was coming up. But things would change the whole time. There would be times when the week before I'd be like, oh, can you come to Stockholm next Wednesday? And it just, so it became, in documentary, you're always fighting this feeling of I'm missing something, or documentaries of this kind, when you're filming a story unfolding in real time, but when you're based in London and the documentary's in Stockholm, that feeling is so acute, and it's quite hard. There's a lot of tension when you're making it, because obviously I don't want to miss anything really. And there was probably 3 or 4 things in that first year that I would really be sort of ruining missing them for quite a long time, because you just think, oh, that was the keystone, that's what we needed. But actually, you have to just sort of believe in the sort of long run really, and keep going.
I've got a question from Rob from Edinburgh, who says, I love the film. How easy was it to edit? And were you doing that as you went along?
No. So we did a sort of 2-week exploratory edit process. I'm gonna get the wrong time here. I think that was in August. I can't remember when we did that, but we did an initial sort of 2-week editing process. And I worked with an editor called Michael Argland on this, who has edited beautiful humanist films, Kingdom of Us, The Hard Stop, amongst many others. And he was really the only person I wanted to work with really on it. And so I was very lucky that Archer's Mark facilitated that, the production company who became the production partner on this. But in terms of like our process, we did a sort of 2 weeks, and then there was just constant conversation really about what I was shooting, what we were kind of aiming for, how things were unfolding. And then we did our last shoot with Roy in October 2019. So we did sort of master interview, so a sort of final interview with Roy, more reflective interview, and then filmed the opening sequence of the film. And then we really kind of got into it in sort of mid-October. And it's, I guess, we were still sort of doing little bits in January. It was a tricky one really, as these things always are. They just sort of expand and spread out. But the main edit block was in that sort of, I guess, 3 months really. But I think it was meant to be less, but rolled out a bit. But I had a lot of footage. I mean, it's 3 years worth, or 2.5 years worth of that time of production and really like the balancing act, just to go into the editing a bit more, was we didn't want to make a process film really, so that sort of human side of Roy. Obviously it's important to set out the context and explain what Roy does and why it's so impressive, but we really wanted that human story to come through as much as possible, and then just use the process of making the film as a kind of, just to gently colour in certainly the sort of last hour of the film. It becomes this sort of way of time passing really. Yeah, it was a tricky one to edit. And also, sorry, as an extra side note on that, my original treatment was actually more conceptual in terms of how I saw the film. Like when I wrote a document for Studio 24, and it was more about the actors that Roy collaborates with, so about the non-actors that he uses, which is just one fascinating part of his process, where Roy literally finds people on the street, or at least is sort of, certainly when Studio 24 started out, that was a big part of the process. Like the guy who plays the lead role in Songs from the Second Floor was discovered in IKEA, I think. And one of the dentist who's who features in my film, he was the Indian restaurant down the road he was found, which is Roy's kind of favourite, or one of his favourite restaurants that he goes to. He found him there and just sort of plucked him out of a group of sort of lively group of people just having a meal there. So it was originally about finding the correlation between these non-actors that Roy works with and the themes that Roy experiences in his life and puts into his films. And it really, we did a couple of test shoots with 2 non-actors, and it really worked. We felt really, really good about it, and we've got a couple of those films floating around trying to find a home for them at the moment. But it really worked. But when this problem with Roy came up, it just felt like it was too much. We were diverging too much away from life at the studio, and also that became our world. Like the walls of the studio became our world in the way that they are Roy's world.
I've got a final question about an element we've not talked about the film. You're a Grammy-nominated filmmaker, and you've made a number of music-themed documentaries. I'm just curious about the role of the way that Roy Andersson uses music in his work, and the appeal of that to you. And also, I've got a final question here as well from the audience. Tina from London also asks about the music in the film. And was there an attempt with your own documentary to sort of echo the music that Roy Andersson uses in his work?
Well, I mean, the composer Roger Guler is another a genius collaborator, so I was very immensely lucky to work with him as well. But I think About Endlessness is much more nostalgic in the way that it uses music, and it's much more to do with memory, and also the way that the narration is written is a nod to a Bob Dylan track as well. So the way that Roy uses it in About Endlessness, that is quite different to how he's used it before, which is his collaborator on Songs from the Second Floor is Benny Andersson of ABBA, and they made this beautiful sort of more operatic music. I think our process and approach really was to definitely try and echo the tone in places, and certainly some sequences, the more sort of light-hearted sequences, we try to capture that spirit, but then definitely as the film progresses, like we reach to a different place really, and it's definitely trying to reflect the experience that Roy's going through really. So the music becomes much more sort of greater, sort of more tidal, I suppose, in the way that it treats the story and reflects the story, and certainly more emotive in the way that it's accompanying Roy's story. But it's interesting with his film though, that how About Endlessness has incorporated music in a different way, and it just has this incredible sort of mercurial, nostalgic feel to it.
Yeah, which is amazing when you compare it to sort of a more jaunty jazziness of something like
Yes.
Use the Living.
Yes.
There's a real contrast there. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. Being a Human Person is now playing in cinemas and also available on Curzon Home Cinema. About Endlessness will be released in cinemas and on Curzon Home Cinema on the 6th of November. But there is also going to be a touring retrospective of Roy Andersson's most recent features, aptly named The Canonization of St. Roy Andersson, for Miracles and Supporting Documents, which includes Being a Human Person and some very special filmed introductions. And they will be gracing local cinemas around the country over the course of the next month. Fred, thank you so much for joining us today. And once again, congratulations with your film.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. And thank you to Curzon, because I said this the other night at the Q&A, but what Curzon are doing now in terms of independent film is amazing, really. So, and we were talking a bit about it before. It's great. You know, we're all very grateful, everyone connected to the film, that we get a chance to talk about it and you know, have it in the cinema and get to share it, really. So thank you to Curzon, especially in this year of all years, to be supporting film in this way.
Brilliant. Thanks, Fred. And just a quick note regarding the next Living Room event, which takes place on Tuesday, the 3rd of November. I will be in conversation with director Koki Grederoich and writer Caitlin Moran about the film adaptation of her book, How to Build a Girl. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. And if you're not in Tier 3 and do feel safe, please, please, please go to the cinema. Bye-bye.